Now it's time for Culture Talk. This is the segment where we talk about the intersection of faith and pop culture and how culturally relevant topics can be used to start conversations about your faith. I'm joined today with theologian Krista Bontrager.
Thanks for having me back, Sandra.
Thank you for coming. You know, I think often about language as an editor. I think about language and also too, coming from a bilingual family, think of how a saying can kind of lose its meaning. It can get lost in translation. Yes. So bilingual people are probably very familiar with that. Oh, it's lost in translation.
Yeah.
When we think about the Bible, believe it or not, some people think that the Bible was written in English.
Right.
And they aren't too familiar, and they certainly don't read the Bible in any other in its original language for the most part.
Which would be the original language of the Old Testament is Hebrew, and the language of the New Testament is Greek.
Right. And so not many people, unless they're in seminary, they're not. The general public maybe isn't reading it in Greek or in Hebrew.
Right.
So when we think about Genesis and we think about the creation days and this conflict that we have within the church, what can understanding the original language do to kind of help this conversation?
Yeah.
So let's talk about Genesis 1 and the verbs used and the words used in that.
Yeah, it's such an important conversation, and I love how we're going to just talk specifically even just about the verbs, because we're kind of pulling back the curtain a little bit to look at the original language. And honestly, when we only look at the Bible in English, most of the time we're going to be okay. We don't want to make people paranoid that they're not understanding the Bible properly if they don't know the original languages. But on the other hand, sometimes when controversies pop up, it's good for us to be able to dig a little deeper. And sometimes when we look at those words in the original language, it gives us insight and it helps us sometimes resolve some of those controversies. So for example, in Genesis 1:1, it says, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Such an important word. The Hebrew word bara. It appears actually 3 different times just in chapter 1, but all in very distinct ways.
So can you give me an example of where bara appears?
Sure, yeah. So that very first verse, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. What's interesting about bara is that it's only ever applied to God. It's only an activity that God can do. Only God can create something out of nothing. Only He can bring something completely new into existence. And in this case, the heavens and the earth.
So that's the creation ex nihilo. When you hear people say that, that's what they mean.
Right.
Right. Okay. So then what other verbs are used?
Yeah. So another verb is asa, which is often translated in English as the word made. That God made the great lights, or that He made humans and He made animals. Now, I think sometimes we don't even notice the subtle difference between create
kind of
and made, but in Hebrew it's different verbs. It's the verb asa. And what I think is cool about this verb is that it's used in everyday language. It's just to make. Like, let's say you and I were to make a cake together. We would take some ingredients, some eggs and flour and sugar and other things, and we put it together, we put it in the oven, and out would come something else from those pre-existing ingredients. And that's kind of what the verb made is like in Hebrew. It's not bringing something into existence for the first time. It's taking something that's pre-existing and then making it into a new form, making something new.
So then when other Christians who have maybe they will call themselves an evolutionary creationist. The distinction though is that God brought it into existence first, and then from the things He brought into existence, He then made something else.
Select things, yeah, and it's its own conversation. That could be its own segment. But for example, humans. What's interesting about humans is that they are both created, bara, and made, asa. And so, that's an interesting thing to probe of like, well, what's new about us? What was created and what was the asa part of this? What was refashioned from pre-existing material?
I love that you give this example because as a non-theologian, I'm going to take a guess that it's the Spirit.
Yeah.
That is the image of God, that is the thing that is the new thing.
Yeah, so that's our position here at Reasons to Believe, is that there are some things that are purely physical, like rocks and plants. Then there's some things that are physical and soulish. So we might think of higher order mammals. They have a physical component, but they also seem to possess this soulish quality of mind, will, and emotions. But humans alone are created in the image of God. So they're physical, they're soulish, and they're spiritual. They worship their creator. So yeah, it's just kind of fun digging beneath the surface there.
But those aren't the only two verbs,
no,
right?
No, not at all.
Give me some more.
All right, here's another one, is haya, which is another very common verb. It's nothing mysterious, it's just to be. And it's in this context in Genesis 1, it applies to let there be this great firmament that happens, and let there be day and night. And it's very nondescript. It doesn't necessarily mean like instantaneously it was day and night. It could have happened over time. There's nothing inherent in the verb itself that has to mean God just sort of poofed that into existence. And a fourth verb that we see, and this happens in Genesis chapter 2, and it's only used in the creation of the woman. That is the verb yatsar, which evokes a kind of this word picture of a divine potter, and how God is reaching in and reshaping the woman in a way that is very distinct to her. And I just think it's a beautiful picture of creating just the right mate for the man so that they can multiply and fill the earth together.
Thank you so much for that, Krista. I really encourage you to check out Krista's study, The Bigger Picture on Creation. You can find that at shop.reasons.org.